3 weeks after I buried my father, my own brother and sister hired lawyers to force the sale of the farm our grandfather cleared with horses in 1938. 2 months after that, I stood in a lawyer's office writing them a check for $340,000, not because I owed them a dime of it, because if I didn't, strangers would own every acre my father died trying to protect. I didn't write that check out of anger. I wrote it because somebody in that family had to remember what that dirt actually cost, and it wasn't going to be either one of them. This one still makes my jaw tight when I tell it, so bear with me because there's a lot of ground to cover before we get back to that check. My name's Danny Kessler, 51 years old. I've got dirt worked so far into the creases of my hands it doesn't come out anymore. Not really. Not even the night before my own wedding 26 years ago, when Kathy handed me a nail brush at the church and told me to try one more time. I'm the oldest of three. Me, then my sister Renee, 4 years behind, then my brother Todd, 7 years behind me. We grew up on 320 acres outside a town so small it doesn't rate a stoplight. Just a four-way stop, a grain elevator, and a Casey's that everybody in 3 townships treats like the town square. If you wanted to find out who died, who got engaged, or whose corn came in light that year, you didn't read a newspaper. You stood by the coffee pot at that Casey's for 10 minutes on a Saturday morning. Our dad, Wendell Kessler, farmed that ground his whole life the same way his own father had. Corn and beans. Hogs when the market made sense, and some years it didn't, and we ran them anyway because Dad said a farm without livestock on it wasn't really a farm. It was just a very large lawn. A stock tank out back that never once in 50 years went a winter without somebody having to break ice on it by hand before school. Usually me, usually at 6:15 in the morning with a flashlight held in my teeth because both my hands were busy. It wasn't a big operation, never was going to make anybody rich. Some years we cleared maybe 40, 50,000 after expenses. Other years we cleared nothing at all and ate a lot of venison somebody's uncle had shot. But it was paid off free and clear before I was out of high school because my dad didn't believe in owing a bank a nickel he could help, and he used to say that a debt-free farm was the only inheritance that couldn't be repossessed by somebody else's bad year. I stayed. Renee left for Des Moines the week after graduation and never really looked back. Married a guy named Chip who sells commercial real estate, and between the two of them, they've built a life out there I don't fully understand and don't need to. Todd went further still. Phoenix first, then Denver, now somewhere outside Austin doing something with software. I'm not going to sit here and pretend either one of them did wrong by leaving. Plenty of people leave a small town and go build something bigger somewhere else. That's not the sin in this story. I want to say that plainly right up front, because it would be easy for me to tell this whole thing like the two of them were villains from the jump, and that's not true, and I won't lie to you to make myself sound better. I liked the work. That's the plain truth of why I stayed, more than any grand sense of duty. I married a local girl, Kathy, who didn't want to live anywhere she couldn't see her own mother's porch light from her kitchen window, and somebody needed to be around when Dad's knees started going. It just turned out to be me. For 20 years, I drove the half-mile between my place and my folks' place, sometimes twice a day in every kind of weather Iowa's got to throw at a person. I fixed fence in January with my hands going numb inside a pair of leather gloves that never once kept the cold all the way out. Gloves I'd have to peel off finger by finger because the leather had frozen stiff around my knuckles. I remember one January morning, I must have been about 28, when the wind chill was sitting at 19 below and a fence post snapped clean off at the frost line, and my dad and I worked that line together for 4 hours without hardly a word between us, because at that temperature, talking just wastes breath you need for the work. That's the kind of quiet my father and I built our whole relationship out of. Not silence because we had nothing to say, silence because the work said it for us. I sat with my mother in the ER in Marshalltown 3 separate times before her heart finally gave out for good. And both times before the last one, I called Renee and Todd from a hallway that smelled like hand sanitizer and vending machine coffee. And both times I heard some version of the same thing. I can't get away right now, but keep me posted. I did keep them posted. Right up through the funeral, where they both showed up in good black clothes and were gone again by the next afternoon, back to their own lives, back to their own kids' soccer games and quarterly reports. The third time, the last time, it was just past 4 in the morning, and I was the one who drove her in, because Dad's hands had started shaking too bad by then to trust him behind the wheel in the dark. She held on to my forearm the whole way, not my hand, my forearm, gripping it the way you'd grip a fence rail crossing ice. And about halfway there, she said, real quiet, almost like she didn't want me to hear it and worry, "I don't think this one's like the others, Danny." She was right. She went a little after 6 that morning, with a nurse I'd never met before or since, standing on one side of the bed and me on the other. And Dad wasn't there because I hadn't wanted to wake him at 4 in the morning to make that drive himself. A decision I've turned over in my head more times than I can count since. I called him from the hospital parking lot afterward, and I could hear something in his voice break that I'd never heard break before, not once in 50-some years. And I remember standing there in that parking lot at 6:15 in the morning, thinking, this is the first time in my life I've ever heard my father sound old. That was 6 years before Dad went. 6 years I had him mostly to myself, and 6 years where I watched a man who'd never once needed anybody slowly learn how to need somebody, which is its own kind of grief, watching that happen to your father in real time. Nobody warns you it isn't one big dramatic thing taking care of somebody at the end. It's 10,000 small things. It's noticing he's worn the same flannel shirt 3 days running and knowing what it means before he'll say it out loud. It's learning to cut a grown man's toenails because his back won't bend that far anymore, and doing it gentle so it doesn't feel like the indignity it is. It's the smell of the little addition off our house, where Kathy fixed him up a room, grab bars screwed into the shower tile, a bed low enough he could get himself in and out of on the good days, Benjay and coffee and the particular must of an old man's sheets. A smell I can still call up whole if I let myself, sitting right here talking to you. I want to give you some numbers, because I think numbers make people understand things that feelings alone sometimes can't. Over those last 2 years, I figure I made something close to 400 trips between my place and his, most of them after a full day's work on my own 400 acres. I filled 30-some-odd prescriptions, drove him to appointments in Marshalltown, and twice all the way to Iowa City for a cardiologist neither one of us could really afford but went to anyway. I lost, by Kathy's count, somewhere around 300 hours of sleep across those 2 years, because a man that age doesn't sleep through the night without needing something, and I was the one who heard him stir. The last stretch, I lifted him myself most days. He'd been a big man once, 6'2", hands like a shovel head, the kind of man who used to sling 100-pound feed sacks off a truck bed like they weighed nothing at all. By the end, I could carry him from the bed to the recliner in one motion, the way you'd carry a sleeping child. And that's a thing a son isn't built to get used to no matter how many times he does it. Renee called every couple weeks, sent nice flowers on his birthday, the kind you order off a website with a card already printed inside that says something generic and warm. Todd called less, but when he did, he told good stories, made Dad laugh. And I won't sit here and tell you that counts for nothing, because it doesn't count for nothing. A man near the end of his life, laughing at a story his youngest son tells him over speakerphone. That's worth something. I'm not going to pretend it isn't. 3 days before he died, he had one of what the hospice nurse called his clear mornings, a stretch of an hour or two, sometimes less, where the medication and the disease both seemed to loosen their grip on him at the same time. I was sitting next to the bed doing paperwork, farm stuff, nothing important. And he said my name the way he used to say it when I was a kid and had done something wrong. Just Danny, flat, expecting my full attention. "Yeah, Dad? You're gonna fight over this place, your brother and sister." It wasn't a question. I started to tell him no, that wasn't gonna happen, and he waved a hand at me, weak but still with enough of my father in it to shut me up. "Don't lie to a dying man, it's bad manners. Just don't let it turn you mean, whatever happens. This ground's not worth you turning mean." I told him I wouldn't. I meant it when I said it, and I'll tell you honestly, there were nights in the months that followed I came closer to breaking that promise than I'd like to admit to you now. He was asleep again inside 10 minutes, and that was close to the last real conversation the two of us ever had. 3 days later, on that Tuesday morning in March, I'm the one who was there when it ended. I'm the one who felt him go still under my hand, my palm flat on his chest, the way you'd check a fence line for a hot wire, and knew before the hospice nurse walked through the door that he was gone. The will had been drawn up 8 years before he died, back when he still figured all 3 of his kids might end up equally close by. Split everything 3 ways, even down the line: the house, the equipment, the 320 acres, right down to a line about his tools being divided as agreed among the children, like he genuinely believed 3 grown adults could sit around a shop table and split up a lifetime of wrenches without anybody's feelings getting bruised. I didn't fight the will. I want that understood, because it matters later. When the lawyer read it out in that little office with the water-stained ceiling tile, I didn't say one word about it not being fair. My dad wrote what he wrote, and I figured the 3 of us would work it out like family does. I was wrong about that last part. 3 weeks after the funeral, I got the first letter. Not from Renee directly, from a firm out of Des Moines. 4 names on the letterhead, the kind of paper that's heavier than it needs to be, just to remind you somebody's paying good money for it. It informed me that my sister and brother had retained counsel to explore all available options regarding the disposition of the estate's real property, and that I should expect further correspondence. I called Renee within the hour, out in the barn, phone wedged against my shoulder, hands still smelling like the calf I'd just pulled a scour treatment on. "Renee, what in God's name is this?" She didn't dodge it, I'll give her that. Renee's never been one to waste time on pleasantries when there's business at hand, and I used to respect that about her more than I did in that moment. "Danny, Chip and I have been talking. We think the smart move is to list the farm, get it appraised, put it on the market, and split it 3 ways in cash. There's a guy Chip knows who handles ag land all over the state, with commodity prices where they've been the last 2 years and cropland going for what it's going for around Marshall County right now. We could be looking at close to $2 million on the whole parcel. That's over $600,000 each, Danny. That's real money." I stood there in the mud with a heifer bawling behind me, and I genuinely did not have words for a second. "I live here," I said. "My cattle are here. Where exactly do you think I'm going to go?" "Nobody's kicking you off tomorrow, but realistically, none of us are farming that ground long term. Todd's in tech. I'm in insurance. You've got 40 head of your own cattle running on your own place already. This is just being practical. Dad would want us to be practical." I want you to sit with that line for a second. Dad would want us to be practical, because it's going to come back around later in this story, and it's going to mean something very different by the end. Here's what I didn't know yet, what I only pieced together over the months that followed, one conversation at a time. Chip's firm had taken a real beating the 2 years prior. A mixed-use building downtown he personally guaranteed a loan on had sat close to 40% vacant since a couple of anchor tenants pulled out post-pandemic, and Chip was carrying a note on it that ran, by Renee's own later admission, somewhere north of $11,000 a month, whether the building earned a dime or not. Her third of a farm she hadn't set foot on in 3 years wasn't sentiment to her. It was the number standing between her family and a very hard conversation with a bank, a conversation she'd apparently already had once and didn't want to have again. Todd's version of that same pressure looked different but wasn't lighter. He'd left a stable senior engineering job 2 years back for a startup, the kind of move that sounds bold on a Thanksgiving table and looks a lot shakier from the inside. His equity, by his own later admission, was worth exactly what somebody's willing to pay for it, which right now is nothing, and the company had just done a round of layoffs that spared him but cut his salary 12% temporarily, which is a word that never means what it says. He had a second baby on the way with his wife Priya at a lease outside Austin, running him close to $2,600 a month for a 2-bedroom that wasn't going to fit a family of 4 much longer. I didn't know any of that on the phone that day. All I heard was my sister telling me, in the same clipped tone she probably used closing an insurance claim, that Dad's ground ought to be turned into cash and split up. Todd called 2 days later, backing her up, though gentler about it, the way Todd's gentle about everything until he isn't.
Danny, listen, I know this is hard to hear, but you've got to think about this like adults, not like it's still 1995 and we're all fighting over who gets the good bedroom. He used phrases like not letting sentiment override sound financial planning, words I'm fairly sure he'd picked up secondhand from some podcast on his commute, and told me he understood it was emotional for me, being the one closest to Dad at the end. He said that like it was a small detail, like those 2 years were a footnote instead of the whole shape of what I'd given up to be there. You weren't here, Todd. Either of you. Not really. That's not fair, and you know it's not fair. I called every week I could. I flew in for the surgery. I've got a life out here too, Danny. It's not like I was off vacationing while you— He stopped himself. Look, I'm not trying to fight with you. I'm trying to be practical about a piece of dirt none of us are going to be farming in 20 years anyway. I offered them both to buy them out myself. Fair value, financed over time if that's what it took, just to keep the ground whole. I remember standing at my own kitchen counter making that offer, watching Kathy across the room pretending not to listen while she folded laundry, her jaw set the way it gets when she's holding her tongue for my sake. Renee's answer came back 2 weeks later, not as a phone call, a certified letter, this one signed by an attorney named Gregory Faust, informing me that under the terms of the will, all 3 heirs held equal, undivided interest in the real property, and that absent a voluntary buyout at a price acceptable to all parties, my sister and brother intended to petition the court to force what the letter called a partition sale of the whole 320 acres, the house, the barn, the ground my grandfather cleared by hand, auctioned to whoever bid highest, family, stranger, didn't specify which one, because it didn't matter to the letter which one it turned out to be. I read that letter standing at my own kitchen table, the same counter Kathy had been folding laundry on 2 weeks before, and she watched my face change and asked what was wrong, and I couldn't even get the words out for a minute. My hands were shaking a little, which isn't a thing that happens to me often. I've pulled calves in blizzards with steadier hands than I had holding that piece of paper. It got worse about 10 days after that letter. I came back from a feed run one afternoon and there was a car in the drive I didn't recognize. A woman in a blazer standing near the house with a clipboard and a tape measure, walking off the footage of the porch like she was sizing it up for a listing photo. Turns out Chip had put her in touch with the family, told her the place was likely coming to market soon, and she'd figured she'd get a jump on measurements before the snow came. She hadn't called ahead, hadn't asked me, the man living in the house, a single thing. I was polite about it, more polite than I felt, told her the property wasn't listed, wasn't going to be listed, and she needed to leave. She got flustered, apologized, said Chip had given her the impression it was already decided. I stood in my own driveway and watched her back out, and I remember the particular kind of anger that isn't loud, the kind that just sits low in your chest like a coal that doesn't need tending to keep burning. That was the moment this stopped feeling like a family disagreement to me and started feeling like something closer to a siege. Word got around town fast after that, the way it does. Somebody at the Casey's mentioned to somebody else that the Kessler place might be going up for sale, and by the following Saturday, I had two separate neighbors ask me about it over coffee like it was already settled fact, and a third one, old Harlan Petty, who'd farmed next to my dad for 40 years, just put a hand on my shoulder and said, "Your dad would have had something to say about that," and didn't need to say another word past it.
I hired my own lawyer, a sharp, no-nonsense woman out of Grinnell named Patricia Voss, recommended to me by a neighbor who'd used her in a boundary dispute a few years back, and came away saying Patricia was the only attorney he'd ever met who charged by the hour and still seemed to actually want you to spend less of it. I told her the whole mess, start to finish, sitting in her office with a legal pad in front of me that I never once wrote on because my hand wouldn't hold steady enough for notes. She asked me one question that sent me somewhere I hadn't let myself go yet. She asked if there was any older paperwork tucked away anywhere in the house, anything from my grandfather's time, any prior deeds, any side letters. She said, families that have farmed the same ground for 3 or 4 generations sometimes have more paper trail than anybody currently living remembers exists. That's how I ended up on the floor of the spare bedroom on a Sunday evening, Kathy beside me, going through my father's old cedar chest, both of us cross-legged like a couple of kids on Christmas morning, except what we were unwrapping was grief instead of presents. I'd been putting off going through that chest for months. Grief does that to a person, makes going through a dead man's drawers feel like admitting all over again that he's really gone. The room smelled of cedar and dust, and underneath both of those, faint enough to nearly break me clean in half, a little bit like my father's old spice, a bottle of which I later found unopened in his medicine cabinet and still have on my own bathroom shelf, unused because I can't bring myself to throw it out, and I can't bring myself to use it either. We found photographs first. My dad at maybe 25, standing next to a farmall tractor with his own father, my grandfather Elmer, both of them squinting into the sun in matching overalls. A photograph of my mother on their wedding day, 1971, standing in front of the same farmhouse that's still standing today, looking impossibly young. A report card of mine from 3rd grade that my father had apparently kept for 40-some years with a C- in penmanship circled in red, and in the margin, in his own hand, Danny writes like he's in a hurry to get back outside. He wasn't wrong. Then, near the bottom, under a stack of old life insurance papers, a manila folder my father had labeled in his own blocky handwriting, block letters pressed hard enough onto the paper that you could feel them from the back side. Farm, do not lose. Inside was a copy of the original 1938 deed, the paper gone the color of weak tea, my great-grandfather's signature on it in a hand so formal it barely looked like handwriting anymore, and clipped behind it a document I had never once seen in my life. Something my grandfather Elmer had filed back in 1987, in the last years of getting his own affairs in order, a few years before the stroke that eventually took him. In plain terms, it said that any descendant who had lived on and actively farmed the land for at least 15 years running held first right to buy out the other heirs at a fair, independently appraised price, rather than the whole place ever getting thrown onto an open auction block where family and strangers could bid against each other on equal footing. My grandfather had seen this exact fight coming close to 40 years before it happened, and he'd built a door out of it into the deed itself, quietly, without ever once telling a soul as far as anybody living could recall. I sat on that floor and read it maybe 6 times straight through. Kathy read it over my shoulder and just put her hand flat between my shoulder blades and let me have the minute I needed, the same way I'd held my hand flat on my father's chest 3 weeks before that. I didn't feel triumphant, if that's what you're picturing. Mostly, I felt like an old man I barely remembered. I was 9 when he passed, and my memories of him are mostly a smell of pipe tobacco and a laugh that came from somewhere deep in his chest, had reached across 4 decades to put a hand on my shoulder and say, "I got you, son." That hit different than winning ever could have. Patricia had it verified inside a week, properly filed with the county recorder's office, properly stamped, clean as could be. In plain terms, it meant Renee and Todd couldn't force an open sale to outside buyers, not while I met the residency and farming requirement, which I cleared by a mile, close to double the 15 years required. It meant the price would be set by a neutral, independent appraiser instead of a bidding war between family and strangers. That's about as deep as I need to take you into the legal weeds, because honestly, the paper only mattered because of what it let me do next. It wasn't the point of the story, just the key that opened the door to it. I didn't want a war. Everything I did after finding that folder, I did slow and I did careful, because some things are worth doing right, even when doing them right costs you more than doing them fast would. I had my own history on that ground documented, close to 30 years of tax filings, crop insurance records, farm service agency paperwork, proof I hadn't just lived near the place, but worked it, planted it, harvested it, paid taxes on the income off it, every single year going back to when I was 22 years old and first started farming alongside my dad instead of just helping him on weekends. I had the whole property appraised fair and neutral by a man named Kurt Anderson out of Ames, somebody with no connection to either side of the family, and a reputation, Patricia told me, for appraisals that held up in court because nobody could ever find an angle to argue with. Kurt walked the whole 320 acres with me on a cold morning in April, kicking at the soil in 3 or 4 spots, asking about drainage tile, asking when the barn roof had last been redone, writing in a little notebook the whole time. His number came back at just under $2 million for the full parcel, house and outbuildings included. $1,940,000 to be exact, a number I've got memorized the way you memorize a phone number from childhood, whether you want to or not. My share owed to Renee and Todd, 2/3 of that total, split between them, worked out to $340,000 combined. I didn't have that kind of money sitting anywhere, and I want to be honest about that part, because I think people watching this who've never farmed might not understand how tight the margins really run. My own 400 acres in a good year might clear me 80, 90,000 after seed, fertilizer, fuel, equipment payments, and insurance. In a bad year, and we'd had 2 bad years running right before this, with a wet spring that pushed planting back 3 weeks and a dry August that cut yields close to 20%, I might clear 20, 30,000, barely enough to cover the mortgage on my own place and keep the lights on. $340,000 is not a number a working cattle and grain operation just has sitting in a drawer. So I did what farmers around here have done for 100 years when the ground mattered more than the comfort of not owing anybody anything. I went into the bank in town, sat across from a loan officer named Diane Voss, no relation to my lawyer, small towns just recycle names, and asked to mortgage my own place, my own equipment, my own paid-off combine that I'd worked 11 years to own outright to keep my father's place whole. It wasn't a sure thing, and I want to be honest about that part, because I think sometimes these stories make it sound like the money just appears once you decide you're determined enough. Diane ran the numbers twice, quiet, not looking at me while she did it, and told me straight that with 2 bad years already on my books,
The bank's underwriting committee might balk at the full amount without additional collateral. I sat in that office for the better part of an hour while she made calls to somebody above her pay grade, and there was a solid 20 minutes in there where I genuinely believed I was going to walk out with nothing, that I'd handed my siblings a legal right to buy me out of a farm I couldn't afford to keep whole. In the end, they approved it, but only after I agreed to put my own home, the house Kathy and I raised our kids in, not just the Kessler ground, up as additional collateral. 15-year note. Interest rate that made my stomach drop when Diane finally said the number out loud. Monthly payment that meant Kathy and I would be putting off the kitchen remodel she'd wanted for going on 6 years, putting off a lot of things, and both our names now on a piece of paper that meant if the cattle market turned or the rain didn't come 3 runs running, we could lose more than just Dad's place. Kathy signed that paperwork without 1 second of hesitation, and I want that on the record too, because a lot of what held me together through this whole fight wasn't grit. It was a wife who looked at a document that put our own home on the line and signed it before I'd even finished explaining the risk. There was a night before I signed anything that I couldn't sleep at all. I got up around 1 in the morning, pulled a jacket on over my long johns without bothering to change all the way, and walked out to the barn in the dark. I stood there with my hand on the fender of my dad's old International tractor, the one he bought used in 1979 and never once traded in, the one that still starts on the second try if you pump the throttle just right. And I ran my thumb along a dent in that fender that's been there since before I was born, a dent nobody in the family remembers the story of anymore. I asked him, out loud, like a fool standing alone in a cold barn at 1 in the morning, whether I was doing right by him or just doing right by my own stubborn pride. I called my Uncle Ray the next morning, Dad's younger brother, 74 years old now and still sharp as a tack, and asked him straight, would Dad have wanted this? Would he have wanted me carrying a 15-year note over ground he might have sold in a heartbeat himself if it meant keeping peace in the family? Ray was quiet a second on the line, long enough I thought maybe I'd upset him. Then he told me something I didn't know. He said my dad had confided in him once, a few years before he passed, sitting on Ray's own porch with a couple of beers between them, that he worried about exactly this. Worried that after he was gone, the 2 kids who'd left would want the money, and the one who'd stayed would want the land, and he didn't know how to write a will that accounted for that without playing favorites while he was still alive to watch the hurt feelings land on somebody's face. Ray said Dad figured his own father's old provision, the one none of us knew existed, would sort it out someday, if it ever came to that, so Dad himself wouldn't have to be the one choosing between his own children from the grave. He told me, if it ever comes down to it, Danny'll find it. He's the one who'll be standing on that ground when it matters, and Dad built that door for whoever's standing there. I sat with the phone against my ear a long time after Ray said that, out on my own front porch, looking across the low fields toward my father's place, close enough that on a clear morning I can still see the line of his old windbreak trees from my own kitchen window. That settled something in me that the appraisal never could have. Not the money worry, that was still real, still kept me up plenty of other nights over the following months, but the question of whether I was doing right by my father. I was.
Renee called me herself 2 weeks after Patricia sent the paperwork over. First time she'd called instead of going through a lawyer since the whole mess started. Danny, what is this? What is this document your lawyer sent? I told her plain, standing on my own porch with the phone in one hand and a cup of coffee going cold in the other. Grandpa's provision, filed and recorded in 1987. My 29 years of farming history verified 6 ways from Sunday. An independent appraisal neither of us could honestly argue with, and a legal right under our own family's deed that meant she and Todd could not force an open auction of that farm to strangers, family, or anybody else as long as I met the residency and continuity requirement, which I did easily with room to spare. There was a long silence on the line. Long enough I thought the call had dropped. Long enough I actually pulled the phone away from my ear once to check the screen. "So we don't have a choice," she said, finally. Not a question, a realization landing somewhere heavy. I told her, "You have the choice you always had. Sell me your 2/3 at fair appraised value. I've already got the financing lined up. You'll have your money inside 60 days. Clean, no fight, no legal costs eating into what you walk away with. Or we can let the lawyers grind on it for a year and a half, and you'll end up in the exact same place, just poorer for the legal fees and madder at each other than you already are." Chip's going to be furious. He had a whole plan built around us clearing 600 or 700 each off an open sale. "I know he did," I said, and I felt something in my chest go tight and hot at the same time. "But that plan was never yours to build on, my back, Renee. That farm isn't a line item on somebody's spreadsheet. I buried our father with these hands. You buried him with paperwork." I hadn't planned to say that. It just came out. 4 months of everything I'd been carrying finding the only door available to it. She didn't answer that right away. When she did, her voice had gone somewhere quieter than the businesslike tone she'd used the whole time we'd been fighting. "I didn't know it was that bad those last 2 years. You never really told me how bad it got." "You never really asked," I said. Not cruel, just true, said as plain as I'd say the weather. She told me then some of what I've already told you. Chip's building, the loan he'd personally guaranteed, the school payments, the number she apparently been running in her head every night for close to a year, a number that had nothing to do with our father and everything to do with staying afloat 5 hours away from every bit of what had actually happened to him. I told her I was sorry I hadn't known any of that. She told me she was sorry she hadn't asked about any of what I had carried. We ended up talking for almost 40 minutes, longer than we'd talked in probably 5 years combined. Somewhere in there, she started crying, quiet, the kind you can hear even through a phone, and admitted she'd been so scared about the building and the tuition payments that she'd stopped letting herself think about anything except the number the farm could become. "It stopped being Dad's place in my head," she said. "It just became the number. I hate that I let it become the number." Todd called 3 days after that, once he'd talked to Renee himself and heard her side of that 40-minute call secondhand. Todd's never been the one holding the line in our family, more the one who moves with whoever's talking loudest and truest. And once the loudest voice in the room shifted toward honesty instead of leverage, he shifted with it. But not before he gave me something of his own first. "I owe you the same thing Renee gave you, I guess," he said, and he sounded tired in a way I hadn't heard from him since he was a teenager. "The startup did another round of layoffs 2 weeks ago. I made it through this one too, but everybody knows the next round's the real one. Priya's due in March. I've got maybe 4 months of runway if I lose that job tomorrow. And I've been doing math on a farm I haven't set foot on in 3 years because I was too scared to look at the math on my own life instead." "You should have just told me that," I said. "Would it have changed anything?" I thought about it a second, standing there on my porch, same as I had with Renee. "No," I told him honestly, "but I'd have understood you a lot sooner." He laughed a little at that, short and not entirely happy. "Runs in the family, I guess. None of us are real good at saying the thing until we're standing right on top of losing something." His own lawyer tried one more push before folding, questioned whether the 15-year residency clock had really run the way we claimed, and Patricia sent over tax filings and farm service agency records going back to 1997, 29 years of me showing up on paper every single spring and fall, and that was the end of that particular argument before it ever really started. We closed 61 days later on a gray Thursday morning in Patricia's office, the same water-stained ceiling tile watching over the whole thing that had watched over the will reading nearly a year before. I signed a cashier's check for $340,000, and I felt my stomach turn over even as my hand moved across the paper. That's real money. That's 15 years of a note now riding on cattle prices and rainfall doing right by me. But something in my chest settled that hadn't settled once, not fully, since the morning my father died with my hand on his chest. Renee and Todd both came back for it, which surprised me. I don't know if it was guilt or curiosity, or just wanting to see the place one more time before it became, fully and legally, only mine. We ended up standing in the yard afterward, the three of us, in a quiet that wasn't easy, but wasn't hostile either. The kind of quiet my father and I used to build fence in. Todd looked out past the barn toward the back 40 and said, kind of quiet, "Dad used to let me drive the old International out there. You remember that tractor? He'd sit me right up on his lap, let me steer while he worked the pedals." "I remember," I told him. "I stood in that same barn at 1 in the morning a few weeks back, hand on the same dent in that fender, asking him what to do." Todd got quiet at that, genuinely quiet, not performing it. For 20 minutes or so, we just stood there in the yard and talked about the place the way you'd talk about a person who'd passed. This field that flooded out bad in '93, the fence line Dad and I rebuilt 3 summers running in that 19 below cold I told you about earlier. The smell of the hog barn on a July morning that none of us, not one of the 3 of us, could quite call unpleasant, even though by any objective measure it absolutely was. Renee hugged me before she left, first time since the funeral, told me she was sorry it took lawyers before it got to honesty between us. I told her I was sorry too, for my part in that same silence. Sorry I'd let 2 years of exhaustion turn into a wall instead of a bridge. Sorry I'd assumed she didn't care instead of just telling her plain how bad it had gotten. Word got around the coffee pot at Casey's the way it always does, the same way word had gotten around when it looked like the place was going to sell. Old Harlan Petty stopped me in the aisle a few weeks after the closing and just said, "Heard you kept it whole," and nodded once, like that closed the book on the matter as far as he was concerned. That's the whole review I ever got out of this town, and it's the only one that ever mattered to me. It's been 3 years now since that Thursday in Patricia's office. The note's about half paid down. I run leaner than I used to, put off Kathy's kitchen remodel 2 more years than either of us wanted, sold off a piece of equipment I didn't strictly need to help make an extra principal payment last winter. But the ground's whole, still in the family, still planted the way it's always been planted. Corn and beans and hogs when the market makes sense. Renee calls more now, real calls, not just holiday texts with a thumbs up emoji. She brought her girls out last summer for the 4th of July, and I stood on the porch and watched her youngest, 7 years old, climb up onto that old International seat with her grandmother's stubborn chin and her great-grandfather's easy laugh, 30-some years after her Uncle Todd sat in that exact same spot. Same dent in the fender under both of them, same worn patch on the seat, same afternoon light coming down gold through the barn doors the way it's come down every July of my whole life. The way it's come down every July of my whole life. Todd's talked lately about maybe moving back this direction someday. Says Austin traffic in the summer heat down there are wearing on him worse every year. Says Priya's been asking about what Iowa winters are really like. I don't know if it'll happen. I told him if it does, there's a porch light that'll still be on, same as it always was. Same as it was the night I stood out there with a phone against my ear, listening to Uncle Ray tell me about a conversation between 2 brothers on a porch that I never got to hear firsthand. Some evenings I still walk that farm at dusk, same as I always have, gloves on, even in summer, out of 40 years of habit, checking fence, checking cattle, watching the light go copper over ground 4 generations of us have now put our hands in. I stop sometimes under that old oak where my mother's card table used to sit, and I think about a man I barely remember, sitting in some lawyer's office back in 1987, already thinking about a fight he'd never lived to see, writing down on paper the only kind of love a stubborn old farmer knew how to leave behind. Not a hug, not a soft word,
just a door built 40 years early, so his family's ground would still be his family's ground long after he himself was dirt. What I'd want you to know if this ever happens to your family. I've had enough people ask me about the legal side of this since I started telling it that I want to take a minute and just lay it out plain because I think it might actually help somebody watching this tonight, and that matters more to me than just telling a good story. First, something that isn't specific to my family and might actually matter more to you than anything else in this story. What almost happened to us, a sibling forcing an entire family farm onto an open auction block just because they held equal legal ownership on paper, used to be a lot easier to do than most people realize, and it's actually happened to real families right here in Iowa. There was a case, Newhall versus Roll, a farm family right here in this state, where a court ordered a family farm sold at open auction over one sibling's objection, simply because the old partition laws didn't give the sibling who wanted to keep the land much of a way to stop it. That case is a big part of why Iowa passed something called the Uniform Partition of Heirs Property Act back in 2018. It's now law in more than 20 states. In plain terms, where it applies, it gives family members who want to keep inherited land a real right to buy out the ones who want to sell at a fair, independent appraisal before any court can force the whole thing onto an auction block. I'm not a lawyer, and I'm not telling you this instead of talking to one. I'm telling you because I didn't know this law existed until I was already neck-deep in my own fight. And if just one family watching this looks up whether their state has adopted it before they end up where I was, that's worth more than the whole rest of this video.
That's worth more to me than the whole rest of this video. Beyond that, if you've got land that's been in a family more than one generation, go looking through the old paperwork before you ever think you'll need to. Deeds, amendments, anything with a county recorder's stamp on it. Most families don't know what their own grandparents quietly filed away decades back, and most lawyers won't think to ask unless you tell them there might be something there. Patricia only found ours because she asked the right question at the right moment. I could just as easily have never mentioned that cedar chest at all. If you're the one who stays and works the ground, document it every year. Tax filings, FSA paperwork, anything with a date on it proving you were there and you were working, not just living nearby. 29 years of paper is what kept my farm out of open auction. 2 or 3 years of paper might not have held up the same way. And get an independent appraisal before anybody's emotions are running hot enough to argue about a number. A fair, neutral figure that both sides can look at and not find an angle to fight over saved my family probably a year and a half of court costs and a relationship with my sister I don't think would have survived a courtroom. But here's the last thing, and it's the thing I actually care about most. None of that paperwork would have meant a thing if Renee and I hadn't finally had one honest phone call. The provision from 1987 gave me the leverage to slow things down. It didn't fix anything between us. What fixed it was 2 people finally telling each other the truth about what they'd been carrying. Me about 2 years nobody else saw, her about a building and a loan she was too proud to mention. Get the paperwork right, but don't let the paperwork do the talking that only you can do. If you've ever fought your own family over land or a house or anything that meant more than money on paper, tell me about it in the comments below. I read every single one of them, and I mean that. And if this one hit close to home, stick around, because next week I've got a story about a widow whose stepson tried to have her declared incompetent over her late husband's timber rights and what she pulled out of a safety deposit box that ended the whole fight in one single afternoon. You won't want to miss that one. Here's what I want to leave you with tonight. My sister and brother weren't bad people. I need you to hear that clearly because it would be easy to tell this story like they were villains and I was some kind of saint standing alone against them, and that isn't the truth of it, not even close. They were people 5 hours removed from 20 years of daily reality, doing math on a farm the way you'd do math on a stock, because distance does that to a person. It turns a place into a number if you let it. And both of them had real reasons, real fear, real pressure pushing them toward that number. I don't blame either one of them for the distance. I blame the moment we let the number matter more than what that ground had actually cost to keep whole, and the moment we finally stopped letting it.
That's where it went wrong, and that's where, eventually, it went right again. Not the wanting money. Everybody's entitled to wanting what's rightfully theirs. It went wrong the second paperwork tried to stand in for 20 years of showing up. And it went right again the second two people who loved the same dead man finally sat down and told each other the truth. Somewhere, 40 years back, an old man who loved his family enough to plan for a fight he'd never lived to see made sure that door would still be standing open when we finally needed to walk through it.